but
So
that's one.
just to fill it in on this one, in the sense that the Buddha, after he achieved enlightenment, didn't stay under the Bodhi tree. He immediately reorganized his thoughts, took those motivating elements, and began finding disciples. And so in Buddhism, that outflow is an absolutely crucial part of the entire tradition, is how will you give away that which you've been given. And so the point was, if you are just receiving knowledge after knowledge after knowledge, you become a cesspool of knowledge. Was sort of what I was trying to work on. And it's hard for students because it is so enjoyable to accumulate knowledge. It is, if you're a student at heart, lifelong student is a term we fling around right now. But if you're a student at heart, then that's such a joy, is to read books and to study things and bring things and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But I encourage you to be a teacher of somebody, somewhere, somehow, just to let it flow through you. One of my professors in my master's program said that there's only two things you know: that which you've taught and that which you've written. Anything else, you have no idea if you know it or not. And there's some hyperbole in there. But whew, if you have written on the topic, if you have taught on the topic, you know it. You might be wrong, and you're still teaching it wrong, but you know what you know. And so that's just was my encouragement is to follow the Buddha when it comes to how you folks are dealing with the knowledge that you're acquiring. Is talk about it to your family. What a great conversation. Go home and talk about it to somebody. And that's teaching. Just rehearsing some of the core ideas that you liked or disliked. Just that's the teaching of it. And so thank you. I appreciate it. I'm glad you heard that. It's an important part of the Buddhist story, as with any religious community. You should turn it around and let others know about it. Thank you. My dissertation was on the role of religious thought in the reform of healthcare. What would be the point? What would be the advantage of it? And so it was trying to recover something that really has been lost over the last 50 years in American healthcare. And so that's just sort of, and which led to the conversation of Buddhism and healing. I did my master's work on that topic, on comparing three really unknown traditions: the Buddhist tradition, as far as in this part of the world, the Buddhist, the Mexican spiritualist, and the shamanistic traditions, and comparing those as lost in our way of thinking when it comes to medical arts, and to try and recover what those meant, all religious in their orientation. But you realize very quickly when you study Hinduism that you're just talking about life. They put a religious label on it, but it's just life. So, you find out pretty quickly it's pretty helpful when it comes to the conversation of what some of these major areas of thought are.
In your Mexican studies, did you look into Castaneda at all?
No, Mexican spiritualism was the main focus, which is, I don't believe it's interrelated. My question for American Buddhists is, how do they handle these four profound features of early Buddhism? And what happens if some of this gets ejected? What's it mean to Buddhism if these primary founding principles of the Buddhist sangha, chastity, no possessions, begging for food, non-violence, what is Buddhism if you don't do this?
That's sort of the monastic sort of side of it. But a lot of, like in the Tibetan traditions or maybe other traditions, and even, I think even in the Indian tradition, they'll have a stage of life where you're a householder, and then there might be another stage where you go into the more religious.
We saw that in Hinduism.
Yeah. And so, so that to me looks like more like a monastic, and it also reminds me of the cover art of this music, where there's these two young men walking down, this road, probably in Thailand or somewhere, One of them they look like brothers, right? And they're holding hands, which I think over there it's pretty common for men to hold hands.
Yeah.
And so there's the one guy on one side, he's in the monk's outfit, he's dressed up. You can see that he is, and he has kind of a stern look on his face, or whatever. The guy on the other side's got an AC/DC shirt on, and he's smoking a cigarette, and he's smiling or whatever. And it also, if you look on the street, on the monk side of the street, everything is clean and nice. And on the other side of the street, there's all this garbage and all this stuff like that. And it's like a real photograph, I mean, it's just one of those magical photographs that sort of, there's this split. And anyway, I just...
Okay, but what you've done is you've identified what happens in every religious community. And that's the distinction between what I call the spiritual elites and the laity. Every tradition has spiritual elites and laity. Every tradition has a higher moral expectation of their spiritual elites than they do with the laity. And so what's the point? Why would your spiritual elites, let's just start there, and why would you expect them to do these four things?
To show their realization and just to show their dedication to their beliefs.
Okay, so
they can actually change their lifestyle. They can actually make real changes in the way they're living. That a lot of other people, takes quite a bit of discipline to,
Excellent. So it's a clear marker to the rest of the community that you're all in if you're participating in these areas. So why else would they be expected of the spiritual elites, but not expected of the laity?
Society still has to function.
Okay, so and so to have chastity means no society.
Yeah.
In the long-term extension of that idea, at some point you're done. There's a few in American history that have tried to have chaste relationships, but
What's that?
the Oneidas,
Shakers
the Oneidas were. The Shakers were and the Oneidas were, which is your silverware that you have in your drawer.
Oh,
the
no.
Oneida silverware. They were a chaste society. The Shakers were a chaste society. So they recognized that chastity has a significant spiritual benefit, tried to live it out, and simply live on new adherents that would come into their community, and that's how they would grow and maintain. But it's pretty tough if you don't have kiddies coming along to build your religious community.
Which is where they got the whole sisterhood, brotherhood. So they referred to each other as sisters and brothers a lot because that's how you refer to yourself, when you are chaste.
No possessions. Pretty hard to do if you're just a lay adherent. But an important part of the spiritual elite. Why? What are we touching on theoretically with no possessions? And begging for food goes with that.
The materialism. Materialism is contrary to spirituality.
In all your religions, there's a dissonance there. Why? Why does spirituality compete with your spirituality and your materials that you like to acquire?
Well, spirit is about spirit. It's not a material thing.
So your focus is in the wrong place. Your focus is easily distracted. And it's hard to say, wow, I need this, I need this, I need this to make my life more fulfilling, to pay for my bills, to do the normal householder things, it's pretty hard to not acquire possessions to accomplish what you need to do in your career and your family and everything else. And so possessions become a necessity for advancement. And so if you have no possessions, that means somebody is taking care of the roof over your head and the food that you need. Otherwise, life ceases to exist in a pretty significant way. And so for spiritual elites in the monastic, the monasteries are built to provide the roof over their head, and then where do they get their food? Where do the spiritual elites go to get their food? They don't typically they can eat in the monastery, but not your usual thing in most Buddhist monasteries. Where do they go?
The community.
They go out in the community and do what?
Beg.
They beg. So that your number one symbol of Buddhism is the wooden begging bowl. That's what you're given at your ordination, is you change your clothes and you're given your begging bowl. And so, nonviolence, where does that work its way out? Is that just a spiritual elite thing? The laity can beat the crap out of anybody they want?
That one kind of sticks. That one seems to be one of those that isn't just for the elites. It should be.
Okay, so this is an expectation of the laity. How does it work its way out? What's a feature of nonviolence in the lives of Buddhist laity?
You don't need meat.
You don't eat meat.
Okay.
Yeah. There's that association of meat and violence, that you being violent to the animal. So the vegetarianism is a pretty natural extension of Buddhist thought, and it's a religion of India thought. It wasn't discarded as Hinduism melded into Buddhism. The nonviolence was an essential part that flowed into that. So that carried. Okay. So the sangha, how do we do it? And then his death, called parinirvana. And so the Buddha is almost 80 years old. Why is that significant? 80 years old. We stop with the numbers. Anything significant about that? I have nothing to add. 80, to my knowledge, isn't terribly significant from a numerology point of view. But why is it just significant generally? His age. He's 80. Compare that to any other tradition you know.
He lived a pretty full, long life.
Full life.
2,500
Okay.
years ago, that's very old, right?
Yeah,
That's
really old.
ancient,
Yeah,
2,500 years ago. What would you guess the lifespan would have been?
40.
40 to 50 is pretty normal.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you can break out of your 50s, you're pretty old. Who else, which founders of any religion you're aware of didn't make it to 80 or did make it into old age? Any background knowledge you have to the topic?
Well, the only disciple we know was John.
Okay, so in Christianity, only one of the 12, John, made it into, we assume, his 90s. So he was the only one that made it. The rest of them, all martyred. They would have been in their 40s or 50s, and they were all martyred in whatever setting they were in. So they were still old compared to the founder,
Oh, right.
Jesus. How old was he?
Probably in his 30s, maybe mid-30s, maybe?
Yeah, 33, 34. His ministry was only 3 to 4 years long. That was at the longest would be 5, but that's a funny count to that one. Most would say 3. You could stretch it to say 4. Everything he did was in the scope of 3 to 4 years. So all of Christianity is trying to glean that kind of awareness. What that resulted in, they have very little political thought. It's woven into Christianity. All of theirs tend to be community thought. How should the community function? How should the community relate? That's really what he focused on during his ministry. But the result was, and we see that particularly in Islam, which has a much stronger political basis. And there's much more thought. Why? Because Muhammad was also in his 60s. I think 67 is my memory for Muhammad. So he had a thorough course of life where he could teach his adherents and give them political theory as well as. Now you come to the Buddha. He's 80. He should have taught everything necessary, not only for individual and family and community, but also political structure of a broader community should have been easily woven into his teachings. So you get a full panorama of life. You get someone young, a householder, you get someone middle-aged, you get someone who is aged. You get all of those opportunities of reflection. So that makes Buddhism very, very broad in its intellectual basis, and gives it a strength that he arrived at to 80. His final message is, be your own lamps, be your own refuges. Take refuge in nothing outside yourself. Hold firm to the truth. We must sever ourselves from all things near and dear to us. In his last words, all composite things must pass away. Strive on vigilantly. Okay, you're sitting in the room. He's just said that, given you a little sermon, said that last phrase, dies. Whew. What's he trying to say? What are you hearing? What is Buddhism?
To me, composite makes me think of aggregate because I hear that in relation to samskara, and so that's what I hear in that sentence. Is that, but I don't know. I may be wrong about that.
Does that word mean all things that are made by somebody?
Yep.
All things that are composed, like everything that we've made.
Including you. All composite things. Your body. That creative force of your mother and father in most cases. I won't talk about the oddities. But in most cases, you're a composite thing. You're composed of the elements of your body. You're composed of so many parts and pieces. So yeah, I would say he's getting them ready for his death, and his body must return to its elements. Who knows? Would be my way of working the word composite. But be your own lamps. Be your own refuges. Take refuge in nothing outside yourself. Whew, what's he saying there? What's he worried about?
Seems like just a lot of self-sufficiency, You don't really need higher beliefs or, people outside of yourself. Be your own teacher, look for the answers within. Don't necessarily look to an outside authority or source to confirm your spirituality.
Excellent. So that he hasn't lost that intrinsic self-awareness. Don't lose that. What's he worried about? What's he worried about that might happen? The minute he dies, what might happen?
Other people coming in and messing things up.
Okay, that others are going to flow into leadership and are going to have a new opinion. So he's shutting that gate on how others might come in and have bring their political prowess to the fore and adjust the teachings. So he's shutting that gate. What else is he shutting off here? He's going to die. How will people treat him?
Oh, yeah. He doesn't want people to think of him as a god.
He doesn't. That's right. And yet, everything he's done in his whole life is extraordinarily meritorious at its least. It's a stunning life that he has now placed in front of them. And you have mostly simple people that come to religious faith. You have all straight up, but the vast majority of all religious traditions are pretty simple. And so when they have this amazing person in front of them, how do they tend to treat the person the minute they die?
Revere them and make them into a god or a deity.
We deify them, don't we? We make them into deities. And so he's shutting that off in first instance, because he knows that's going to happen the moment he dies, is he's going to be made into a god in his simplest people. Oh, his more sophisticated disciples, they know not to go there. But it's the peasants, it's the working folks, it's that working class that just needs something to hang on to. And they will naturally clutch on to what he leaves behind. And so that becomes an important. Hold firmly to the truth. I think that goes with Lynette's saying, careful, there's going to be more conversation. The minute I'm gone, hang on to the truth. And to this day, we can bring out what are presented to us as the Buddha's words as being firm. We must sever ourselves from all things near and dear to us. Again, being careful.
See, there's a tie into Castaneda right there.
What's that? Make the tie.
The sever ourselves from all things near and dear. He told Castaneda if he really wanted to get there, that's what he would have to do.
Okay.
To cut all ties to his old life. You know, had to start fresh and basically, you know, it's like jumping through a door into another universe. So the old one's gone. And then you see it in Christianity, basically the born again kind of thing or whatever. But it's the same kind of ideas. You know, everything changes after that.
And so he completed what's called nirvana, and that's complete liberation without any ties remaining to pull him back into another lifetime in samsara. And so the pathway to nirvana, that reality in nirvana. His funeral pyre, his bones, he was in Hindu tradition. He was placed on a funeral pyre, I assume, in water. But the bones that were left were sent to stupas in the 8 kingdoms of neighboring regions. And so the stupas became that memory of his life.
And you can still see relics of the Buddha, like, making their rounds around the world, pretty much, like this endless tour of the relics of the Buddha.
Yes.
I remember they came to, like, Seattle or something like that, and I was going to go up and see him, but it's pretty interesting to hear, like, just little bits and pieces of his body or something.
I don't remember that. Do you recall about what year that was that they would have made it to?
It wasn't that long ago.
the
It
West
was,
Coast?
it was within the last 10 years, yeah.
Was it really?
But I remember
I missed that.
relics of the Buddha going through, like, Seattle and Portland, and I don't know.
And why would you have gone? What would have been your point?
For me, it's just to see other people, you know, just to go and see what type of people were showing up to something like that. I wasn't really interested in seeing, like, a fingernail of the Buddha necessarily, but I'm sure there's going to be lots of artwork and other, you know, community surrounding that
Sure.
that would come together for that. So.
Very nice.
It probably makes it more real for people. And I know that Catholicism is big on the relics, you know.
Very much.
Oh, yeah.
Very much. Huge part. And it's important because what should you do when you see a relic of the Buddha? Again, if you're a working or lower class, you might consider it's a god. But if you've had some training in Buddhism, what should it do for you?
Very low.
I really like Eastern Orthodox icons. I have one in my office. Sorry I didn't bring it in. Didn't think I'd go here tonight. But the point of an icon, and the icon I have is a Madonna, and baby. And it's just a little wee hand-painted painting of the banana and baby. And from an Eastern Orthodox point of view, it's to carry you through the icon to be like the Madonna. Be a person like Mary, the mother of Jesus. Be carried through the painting to the good things she did in her life, so that you too can do those good things. So the point isn't to venerate them. That's what the Buddha was desperately trying to get away from. But the point is to see through them to that which the Buddha did, and the life the Buddha lived, and the successes that the Buddha was able to achieve, and the teaching. So so the point of relics is to see through, and so if it's successful, that should be how it works its way out. And so things that are left behind, we have some of the words of the Buddha. We call it the three baskets, or the pitakas of Buddhism. We have the collected teachings of the, I think that's it, there it is. The Sutra Pitaka, the collected teachings of the Buddha. What I have, and I don't have all three of them yet in mine, but that's my little copy that I work on. And then you sort of get the theological stuff like that. And so the 3 points, the rules for living of monks and nuns, the Vinaya Pitaka, and the scholarly points, Abhidharma Pitaka, living the life of the Buddha. And so those three become the three baskets of Buddhism. And so I always have to stop and remember I need to order some. You can have references of them. Comments on the Pitakas? Buddha told his followers that the truth, the Dharma, was to be their leader. And he gave us these teachings. So, that's where it began. And they really left the room. Those disciples, those missionaries, they left the room and started traveling. And boy, did they travel. Down through India, over into China, Mongolia, China, Korea, Japan, through Vietnam, back up to China, down to Sumatra, Borneo, Java. So it moved. It's a missionary religion. They really got on their horses and their feet, and down the road they went, and were incredibly successful at doing it. Comments on the movement of Buddhism?
I have just a question about, it seems like a lot of the older teachings of Buddhism are, they I guess the Theravadan tradition in like Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I've heard them claiming that those are like the original teachings of the Buddha, whereas Mahayana and Vajrayana went up through Tibet and into China, and I've heard that kind of described as being like teachings that developed after numerous other people's interpretations. Is that historically like just like a lot of the first disciples of the Buddha basically went into Southeast Asia and that kind of region of the world?
So here's the comparison to all the branches of Buddhism. Anytime religion moves to another person, it changes, it adjusts. And so there's some reasons on why those adjustments were being made, and then they eventually turned into distinct branches. The easiest way to articulate any religion is to realize there's going to be conservative and liberal elements in all religions. And so Buddhism will not escape that. It's going to have its conservative forces, it's going to have its liberal forces. So that as you just mentioned, the Theravada, or the path of the elders, is saying that they're transmitting the original teachings of the Buddha. So, right there. Trying to keep to those original thoughts as closely as they can. And that's the historical definition of a conservative, is stay within the context of originality. We see that in our Republican Party. Stay within the context of the Constitution. So your conservatives, by definition, stay tighter to the as original a document as possible. But go back and remember, how long did we have before we even had the first documents in Buddhism?
Wasn't it like
400 or 500 years.
Yeah. And so the hundreds of years that went on, even with our recognition of quality memory work, even that is going to make you pause a little bit on the transmission of the documents. So there's intensity there within Buddhism. And then you have the next problem. The Pali language is what they're reading it in. Okay? So as Buddhism moved, it's using that language as its primary technique. So when we get into Mahayana, which is called the greater vehicle of Buddhism, let me just give you some more. We're now dealing with Sanskrit. So the minute you change languages, the religion's different. Let alone conservative liberal. Just change languages. Look at how the church changed between Latin to English. Oh my word. The changes that went on because the language changed, and the horrific battles to try and keep it in the original Latin as compared to the English translations were battles that cost many their lives.
Is Mahayana, since you're saying this is going to East Asia, when you say Zen Buddhism, I think of Japanese, but where did Zen Buddhism start? Is it Korea or?
My understanding on the origin of Zen Buddhism is that it's a Korean, and then Japanese, with a concentration now in Japan.
Okay.
That its primary forces are in
And
Japan.
it came out of
I
Mahayana.
assume there's pretty strong Zen Buddhists in Korea as well. And I'll get to that at the bottom
sorry,
here.
I'm sorry.
But it's a good question. As it moves, it changes.
Yeah.
So something's really going to happen, is to go back. By the time we get to Japan, it's assumed that it's changed substantially. And I would argue that Zen Buddhism has the dominant force in American Buddhism. So it's important to know, whatever American Buddhism, it's gone through lots of permutations as it's crossed the waters. And so, and that's but it's important to go back and say, well, wow, what were the precepts of original Buddhism? Nonviolence, you go through the four precepts, and you go, wow, by the time it gets over here, not into that stuff. Well, that's part of how a religion moves. It will be acceptable in some forms, in some people, and some forms will not be acceptable to it. And those adjustments will be made. So as we come to Mahayana, we're seeing that it's liberal. So it's open to all people, monks and lay alike. So that's the definition of a liberal form of the religion. When you're conservative, you hold it to your monks. You hold it to those that know it most precisely. When you liberalize it, you now include more people. But with more people, they want a broader range of beliefs and ways to look at a religion. So that liberal element is important. But this is intriguing. When you change the teachings, you change the religion. Okay? If you've ever had any connections with our Latter-day Saints. Classic example of change the teachings to secret teachings that Jesus gave to Joseph Smith, and you will change the entire religion. And that's what's happened. Though they claim and they have the right to claim, but they want to claim that they're Christian. They have a secret text that's transmitted only to the Latter-day Saints, and that gives you the Mormon faith. Very different than Orthodox Catholic or any of your Protestant faiths. Why? Because of secret teachings that are coming to an individual that is narrating them to his disciples. So Mahayana is distinct because they are working off a different text, and the text will adjust it. And that's, again, classic to liberal. It's like a liberal education. Let's throw all sorts of books in front of you, as opposed to just the Bible. If you had just received an education, an education in the Bible, then your worldview would be dramatically different. I think that's sort of like Scott's background. Now, you had Catholic education, didn't you?
No, mostly Lutheran.
Mostly Lutheran, okay. But again, they narrow your worldview. They conserve what is important in history, so that you are narrow. When you liberalize that, including secret teachings and other teachings, you have a wonderful chance to be a very different Buddhism, and it is. So Mahayana is much broader. And the language itself would adjust it. You have a stronger conversation of the Bodhisattva. Again, whereas this would focus deeply on the Buddha, now the Bodhisattvas are much more engaged. Went into the Chinese Buddhist temple in Portland, and the feature wall, it was an old, I think it was a Catholic church. So the feature wall, the front of the church, now a Buddhist sanctuary. Were these little boxes all along the wall, and every one of them was filled with a different bodhisattva. So it just hundreds, thousands possibly, on this huge wall in this temple. And so the bodhisattva has a tremendous influence on your more liberal way of thinking. You're more conservative, the Buddha. More liberal, the bodhisattvas are now involved. And the writings of the bodhisattvas become writings that you can work with, as opposed to read only the Buddha, read only his teachings, keep it pure. Is that making sense on how these religions all function in the same way, in lots of ways, as they become more liberal? Unlike one who reaches nirvana but remains in samsara to help others, can be celestial beings. We've talked about that. Tantric. And so the tantric traditions, elaborate rituals, intense, sensual, meditative experiences. And so you see this variant. You see this variant of Buddhism. Sorry, I haven't got pictures of all these. The Tibetan Buddhism, called the lesser branch, or the diamond vehicle. You can see how...
Are those the same thing?
Yeah, they're called, in some settings, the lesser branch. In other settings, they're called the diamond vehicle. So it's just ways of defining Tibetan Buddhism. And again, the Tibetan influence is their lamas. So the importance of the Dalai Lama is a feature of Tibetan Buddhism. Well, where's that coming from? It's coming from the ancient soil of Tibet. And the ancient soil of Tibet had their shamans and their spiritualists and their lamas, their spiritual masters. This was the ancient soil of Tibet. And Buddhism, as it came into Tibet, had to come through that soil that was thousands of years more sophisticated and refined, with deep veneration of the people, of their spiritual masters, of their shamans, of their leaders and spiritualists. And so Buddhism had to come through that. And as it came through that, it picked it up and said the lamas will be an acceptable form of Tibetan Buddhism, which marries the ancient traditions with this new Buddhist tradition. And the teachers become the lamas within Tibetan society. And you'll see the same thing when you go into Chinese society. You'll see the ancient Chinese religions right there, but Buddhism coming through. And so as I walked into the Chinese temple in Portland, the first thing I see after the courtyard is a wonderful happy Buddha. I mean, huge happy Buddha. It's got 10 tons. I mean, it's a huge happy Buddha. But it isn't the discrete Buddha. It's the great big one. And then after our conversation on Buddhas, it was always sort of fascinating to realize the point that they were trying to make. And then as I sort of walk through a courtyard, there is one of the ancient gods of China, Guanli. And so Guanli is one of the ancient goddesses of Chinese thought. And there she is in the hallway before you get to the main sanctuary. And so she's sort of in this intermediary place in the temple. And this was the question I was trying to ask the monk. I was trying to see how he was going to handle these divinities that are that pop up in Chinese Buddhism. How do you think through that, knowing that the Buddha was trying to stay away from these divinities? Well, if you're going to meet the people, you have to make your decision. Are you going to force them to be like you, or are you going to be a little bit like them? And we see that that's been the decision of religions through the ages. Do you adopt local beliefs and therefore move into their culture much faster, or do you force them to look like you? An example, when the Methodists came into the Pacific Northwest, the Methodists wanted all the natives to look like them. Well, it just didn't go well for a long time for the Methodists.
Yeah.
Jesuits come in and they married parts of Native American culture into Catholicism. And all of a sudden, Jesuits flourished in their ministry and missions. And so you can make that decision. How are you going to transmit to others that don't know about your beliefs? And the easier route is to accommodate. And so the religious idea that we're talking about is accommodation. If you accommodate the local beliefs, it's very easy to move in and to transform those beliefs, those ancient beliefs that have gotten stale in the lives of people, and their lives are sucky, and they'd like a new something. And this new religion comes along, and whoa! All of a sudden, people's lives are doing better because they're now working in Buddhist thought. And we know why. We talked about that last time. If you stop buying stuff, then you're going to be richer. Well, it's just what Buddhism asks of you. Stop buying stuff. And so if you have that as an advantage and you've got a reason not to buy stuff and become attached to your possessions, then you're going to be richer in the economy than if you buy all the stuff that your economy wants you to buy. And so a religion has that immediate economic benefit to those that adhere to it. And so you're going to have a good message, let alone if because you aren't buying that stuff, your life is better, and your families are better, and things are better. All that comes from your discipline of your desire. So Buddhism is going to work to make a better life for these people. And so then if you include whatever their ancient traditions are, it's a slam dunk. You're coming in. And so that becomes important.
I can think of
Please.
another reason for the use of gods in the Buddhist tradition. One of the there's a pragmatic aspect to it. So like the way the minds work, if I take somebody out in the woods and they're not used to being out in the woods, they might get lost, and I've done this. I've actually hiked out in the Hawaii's and gone out camping, backpacking, and come back, and the guy I'm with said, we should go this way. And I'm like, no, we go this way, And so I eventually convinced him to follow along, and pretty soon we come along this walking stick that he stuck in the ground as we went in. So we're exactly on the path coming out as we went in, and it's like, well, how can I do that? It's because as you do certain things, you build up these structures in your mind. And so when I see the landscape, I already have the structures in my mind in order to store this information, in order to process it.
Excellent.
And so most people have the structures inside their mind to process other people, to process, relationships and these things. So these structures, so the most power that people have in their mind to think about things is thinking about people. So if you anthropomorphize your religious ideas, you can get further with it easier. So I think there's that pragmatic aspect to it. It may be easier for people to catch on to these ideas if they can think about them through that lens.
Excellent. Yeah. It's easier to put something in an existing cubbyhole than build a new cubbyhole in your brain. It's a much poorer